Hi, Dustin Abbott here again, and I've been reviewing some massive lenses as of late for full frame cameras, some big 50mm, 85mm, and 35mm prime options. And so it's been somewhat of a welcome relief to review a very compact little 50mm, and this is an f1.2. This is from Korean lens maker Samyang Rokinon, and so this is their newest mirrorless lens, and it's available for the Canon EF-M mount, also for the Sony E mount, the Fuji X mount, and for micro four thirds cameras. And so this provides a pretty compelling option, and while it is manual focus only, as you can see, it is very nicely compact. It's a great size for mounting on these small mirrorless bodies. But today's episode is really looking at, can this little guy produce the kind of image quality that you're looking for, particularly at those wide apertures? Well, we're going to interactively jump into some images together and take a look at trying to answer just that question. So come along with me and let's take a look. Okay, so we're going to jump right in with an aperture series here and look at the bokeh and overall performance here. So at f1.2, this is obviously a very wide aperture, and so we can see, number one, this lens is able to create a large amount of a defocused area. And then also overall, there is actually a very nice amount of contrast here on our subject, and overall you can see there's actually a pretty great amount of resolution and detail. There is some chromatic aberration, some purple fringing here along this edge, this highly reflective surface that kind of is a strong indicator for me with that. But overall, this is really a very pleasing looking image. Now, there certainly is busyness, concentric circles within the circles of the bokeh highlights here. We can also see overall there is some of that deforming towards a lemon or cat eye shape towards the edges of the frame. Very common. I'm not crazy about it, but it happens with most all lenses. But here towards the center we see nice big soft circles. Now as we stop down to f1.4, we see, number one, that our chromatic aberration is a little bit less, but not highly dissimilar to what it was. You can start to see the changing of the shape towards the edges to where they're starting to close up and they will become more circular as we go. In the middle here you can see just the hint of the aperture blades. There are 9 aperture blades, and overall the busyness remains about the same. Now as we stop down to about f1.8, we're going to find that you can see a little bit more of the aperture blade shape, but we're also getting a more even performance across the frame in circular. Often with a 9-bladed aperture, early on you'll start to see a little bit of the shape, but it holds its own quite well, and that's one of the advantages of that 9-bladed aperture. It really does help with keeping things circular. As we jump in and look at our subject, we see that chromatic aberration is already almost entirely gone. There's just the faintest hint of purple there, and great contrast and resolution here. This lens gives a surprisingly strong performance at wide apertures. Now at f2, we see that as we jump in on the main subject, the chromatic aberration is gone. The sharpness here and contrast is excellent. Overall, the circular shapes across the edges are more consistent. But as we look closer, I don't see the busyness becoming any more pronounced, and also I'm still seeing it's quite soft towards the edges. There's not a highly defined inner circle, and so that's certainly a positive. Now as we go down to f2.8, as I said before, you can see a little bit more of the 9 aperture blades, but overall they still have a very circular appearance. And so here we see obviously no more chromatic aberration at all. Great sharpness, resolution, contrast there. And overall, there is a little bit more of that inner line, but it's still relatively soft, and so that's still a good performance there. Now at f4, we see that the aperture blade's a little bit more pronounced. We see as we look in, there's just a little bit of a bleeding across the edges as you kind of begin to move towards the star shape that will eventually form from those aperture blades. But overall, still a strong performance. And then finally at f5.6, more of the same. So here we are at f5.6, and still overall, we still have a fairly circular shape. You do see that inner line a little more pronounced now, but overall, that was a pretty decent performance. Now on to some real-world images here. And so some of you have seen, I got a bit of mileage out of these tulips I purchased for my wife. So overall here we see, obviously it's very challenging with the amount of light that an f1.2 aperture sucks in, but it's handled these bright areas quite well. They're not really blown out. And if we look here, there's a fair amount of detail that is there even at f1.2, and it also handled the transition to the bright area pretty well. There's not a lot of chromatic aberration there, and so the overall look of the image is quite pleasing. This is also at f1.2. This is the family dog, and so this is one of the early shots that I took, and I was quite impressed that at how well that it did. Number one, there's quite a bit of contrast that's here in this image. She was in quite a dark room, and so I just shot with the available light, and so there is some noise in this image, but you can see the detail there is really quite impressive. Just a little bit of chromatic aberration there, but a very shallow depth of field, but focus was nailed. And if you look at the image kind of globally as a whole, there is definitely a very usable amount of resolution there, even at that very wide aperture. Here's another f1.2 shot, and this just kind of gives us a look at kind of some real-world type bokeh. So along the top of the frame, you see that that's nice and soft, and then these areas, and again here, lots of cream that's been created. And in this area here, where we're kind of moving down towards defocus, a pretty smooth transition overall. You can see a little bit of green fringing there, and but overall chromatic aberrations are they're not bad at all. And on our subject here, we see that there is some nice resolution there in the texture that is showing up of that leaf. And so for f1.2, that's certainly extremely useful. Moving on here, I wanted to take a look, and one thing I always test is the flare resistance of the lens. This lens did not blow me away in that regard, and here stopped down to f11. I wanted to see the shape of the sun star, which is nice, but here there is a pretty strong amount. It's kind of just in one streak, so that's good in terms of trying to get rid of it. But these are very bright ghost effects here that would take some work to eliminate in post-processing if ever you got rid of them completely. So I'm never crazy about that overall. And so just know that if you're wanting to put the sun in the frame with this lens, perhaps in a portrait type session, you're just going to have to be careful to watch to see where the ghosting effect actually appears, and you can probably play with it to position it either out of the frame or in a non-destructive way. So you're just going to have to keep an eye on that should you purchase this lens. This is wide open, and so you can tell a difference here in the kind of the look of this area back here. I'm going to hop back. You can see a little bit more of a circular shape in this area. That's because it's been stopped down more. At f1.2, that's mostly just kind of blurred. So let's look here though at our plane of focus. And so number one, you can see that as far as the resolution, there's a great amount of detail there. There is a little bit of haziness that comes from a slightly reduced contrast. Also, you can see that there is some purple fringing in there. So the chromatic aberrations also give the appearance of less sharpness, although if you look at the image globally, it's quite sharp looking. Then if we stop down to, I believe f2 is what I stopped down to here, we can see a pretty marked amount of difference in the detail area. Number one, there's more contrast there. You've lost any of that kind of hazy type effect, and so contrast is strong, detail is strong, and of course our out of focus region is still very nice here. A little less blown out than what it is at f1.2. So just so you know, when you're shooting, there are some choices to be made sometimes. If you want a really soft background, shooting at the wide aperture, but if you stop down a little bit, you get a little bit more resolution and contrast, and you also get a little bit more circular shapes in your defocused area. So maybe that will be helpful in shooting. Here's a kind of a look at just some real-world environment. I've shot this quite a few times because I always like the scene, and there's a lot of dark woods in my father-in-law's living room. And so you can see here that, on our plane of focus, there's detail where it matters, and then as you go to the out of focus region, it really renders quite nice. I don't find that the subject isolation is quite as intense as it was with the Milvus 85mm f1.4 lens I just reviewed, but of course that is also an $1,800 full frame lens that is about 3.5 times as heavy as this lens. But overall, for being so compact, that's really a very nice performance there. Here again at f1.2, just showing you, you know, what that subject isolation can do, playing a game of Scrabble, and we've got, you know, great detail where it matters here. I'm at a pixel level, and but at the same time, globally, we have a nice defocused area, very pleasing image. Here again, this is stepped back a little bit to more of a medium distance, and just a lot of nice detail. This is a fairly busy background here, and so you can see that it's had to handle some complicated things and really done a pretty decent job of it. And then if we jump in closer, and here I position the sun behind a little bit more, and then in processing I warmed it a little bit to give it a kind of a glow. But we see at close aperture, number one, lots of nice detail there in the veins of the leaf, but it has completely eliminated that background, and so that's what you can do by getting close to your subject. My daughter was out walking with me while I was taking these pictures. I remember this being at f2.8 because I wanted all of her face in focus, but if we look here at the detail, that's pretty incredible how much resolution is taking place there, and so that's a fantastic performance right there at f2.8. Also, of course, this is a very viable portrait lens at kind of one of the sweet spots for portrait shooting. And so overall here at a large aperture, this image looks very pleasing globally, and then looking at it closely, I can see just a little bit of hint of some purple chromatic aberration fringing on her hair and at the edge of her hat, and that transition to the white snow behind. But overall, that's a very nice looking image with some nice subject isolation from it. And so anyway, it certainly is a very viable portrait lens. And the nice thing is, while this is manual focus only, most mirrorless bodies are better than the equivalent DSLRs in having more focus aids along with them. And so that is a beneficial thing. This is just kind of an artistic shot. I wanted to combine a water splash with bokeh highlights. It was a bit of a challenge to pull it off, but I wanted to see this image just because it's cool. I actually post-processed this and tinted it to give it kind of a Valentine's color scheme in sharing the image. But anyway, it was just kind of a cool result from that. This image I just wanted to show you for shooting indoors. This is in the church that I pastor and our senior minister, and so I wanted to just show that you can nail focus. And I did use the EVF for my Canon M3 that I was using for the review, and so it allows you to, if you want to, number one, you can see true depth of field anyway, but it also allows you to magnify in the EVF. And so even at f1.2, focus is obviously very, very good there, and so it is viable. Of course, if you're shooting action, that's another story altogether and takes a lot more work, but for fairly static event work, you certainly can use the lens, and its low light performance would be exceptional. And so, as you can see, despite its tiny size, this little lens packs a whole lot of optical quality into a very compact body. And if you can deal with the issues of it being manual focus and those limitations, you will find that you certainly won't be disappointed with what it can produce optically. I'm very impressed, particularly at the very wide apertures of f1.4, f1.2 even, at how well it is doing and the amount of background blur that it can provide. I will be doing a final review of this lens next week, and so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, there is a link down below to the image gallery, along with a link to ordering this lens for yourself should you be interested. Note also that there is a cine version of this lens available, and as you can see from the great image quality, it would be a pretty tempting option for budding cinematographers that are on a budget and want a kit that they can travel light with. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Have a great day.